I think the difference in drawing a quick sketch and a more considered, more complex scene that takes considerably more time, it's a bit like the difference between throwing a few things into a backpack to stay overnight and packing for 10 or 14 days. Having to be more aware of what we're doing, what we're going to do, and perhaps needing more resources at the start before we embark on this trip to make sure that we enjoy it the way we want by the time we come home. So here's a drawing that took me 75 minutes to draw. That was still drawing fairly briskly, but it was a much more complex scene with quite a few elements that in some ways were challenging. And I realized that if it was going to work, because I really liked this scene, it's a scene somewhere in Italy that one of my children took and sent to me. I really like the flow and the balance and the values and the contrast between the architecture and the leaves and the footpath. I like the little figure sitting there and just some of the other... I thought it came together as a nice story. I thought visually it had nice movement. So I really liked the composition as well. So firstly, we're going to have a time commitment to what we draw. So we need to make sure the composition is strong. And I don't necessarily mean dramatic, although drama normally does make a strong composition, but has elements that we can manipulate, that we can play on to create something that holds attention, well, firstly attracts attention, then holds attention and encourages whoever's looking at it to move throughout the various parts of the drawing. So I felt that this had that, and it was going to be worth the time I spent on it. So the next thing is to really study the reference to work out what challenges am I going to have to create the overall effect I want. And so this is where I start by trying to visualize how my finished drawing will look. What do I want to stand out? What do I want to merge together or rearrange or have feel like it's further back or it's lighter or whatever? Because now I'm going to have to think about what marks are going to create that. And part of that is thinking about what pens am I going to use to do that. Now you can see at this point I'm using a 0.1mm pen, which I use for most of this. I use a 0.2 just for those bushes on the lower left. I might have chosen to go for something a little bit lighter, a 0.05 for what I'm doing now, but I didn't want this architecture to disappear into the background. I didn't want the difference between the marks of this and the heaviest marks at the front to be so great that we almost had trouble going as far as the architecture. Because what I really liked about this was the contrast between the silhouette of this building, this church, and the foliage and the paving in the front, as well as a lighter feel value to the church and a darker value with all the relatively dark greens. So I'm wanting to capture this in some way. So this is the thinking I'm doing in planning this. So where's the focus going to be? Well, I think the focus will be on the architecture because it's the clearest thing to see and silhouettes tend to grab attention. It's in the upper half, which perhaps because it's relatively close to the center will also grab our attention. So that I think is a place where I'm going to put a little more detail than perhaps I would if there was closer architectural or streetscape elements, if it wasn't just trees and foliage in front. Because I want to create that architectural feel and have it a little more dominant perhaps than I normally would for the distance that it is. And I decided that I would just use 2 pens and I would aim for substantially heavier marks and line work down the very front in that low shrub to the bottom left. And then in the center with those trees that go across the midground, I was going to commit to a relatively dark value to separate it from the ink effect of the architecture, to make the building look a little bit whiter than it looks at the moment. because we perceive value in relation to other values. And so even though parts of my building are darker to look at than the photo, because my incline is still wider than the edges that they represent in the photo, if I emphasize darkness in those trees behind, that's going to make the building look a bit lighter. So that's part of my thinking at this point. This is part of my planning. And so I'm going to use all the techniques I use to draw trees and to draw shrubs. And that's not primarily what this is about, but I do have a playlist on that. And so if you'd like to understand how I think about trees and foliage and how I draw them, then I really would recommend that playlist. Or if you just have trouble with trees and foliage, I think it's at least worth giving my approach a go. I've had many people, probably hundreds, say they've been able to draw trees for the first time in their life. Well, trees that they think look like trees. So check those out if foliage is a problem for you. And please hit that like button for me if you're finding this interesting and helpful. Now, I spend less than half the drawing time on what I've just drawn, on the architecture. I always knew that was going to be the case. So sometimes when we want to capture a scene, there's going to be a lot of work and effort in things that perhaps would normally be a bit of a support act. And that may encourage us to try and somehow overly simplify or rush them. I knew this was going to take me over an hour because of all the foliage and the darker values I wanted to create with the foliage. So that means a lot of marks, no matter how quickly you do them. And you can't hatch faster than you can understand, plan and control. Every mark has to be intentional. At this point though, you'll see even right from the start, I'm doing some light hatching over this whole foliage because I want to start to get a sense of a degree of darkness. And I'm not sure exactly how dark that's going to be until I start it. So I've started it. See that dotted line I did across the right mid section? That's just to give me a sense of where the underneath of the trees on the right hand side are going to be, and that will help me space the things between the top of the building and the lower half of the drawing. I draw that light in before I do anything else. I was very conscious of that light. I spotted that early on in the examining, in the observation, and so I was consciously aware that I needed to draw something of the foliage that light post goes through so that I could create the effect that I have of looking through the foliage. And I've only been able to do that by having slight gaps between the ink for the foliage and the ink for the posts. We've just jumped because it's about 4 days later. So sometimes when we have a long drawing to do, we have to allow the fact that we may not draw it in one session. In fact, I would have drawn this in one session, except I actually wasn't well and felt I just needed to stop it because I didn't want to. I didn't feel like I had the energy for all of this foliage that I'm doing now. And I've switched now to the 0.2. Now, notice my edges for these plants are different to the edges for the trees. A lot more, if you like, spiky, jagged effect, because when we look at the foliage, that's how it is. Now, I'm not trying to be overly botanically accurate, but I do want to convey the sense that this is different foliage to what we have in the distance. There's actually a large distance, a long distance rather, between these shrubs in the front and the trees in the back. So I don't want there to be any mistake in terms of what we're looking at, that while it's all foliage, some of it is much closer. So sharper edges drawn with more precision for the particular foliage that it is will help convey that. And so sometimes the actual foliage, botanically, is just so complex, we're better off simplifying it. But as long as we let it be different to the contrasting foliage around, it will serve the purpose just as nicely. Line weight though becomes important. It's not just that I'm using a wider pen. When I switch back to the 0.1 at this point because I'm doing some midground and further back things, but it's not just that I want a wider line. I also can control the heaviness with which I press on it and also the speed that I draw with. And of course, remember that you can watch this at a slower speed. You're watching most of this at 4 times it'll be 3 times the actual drawing speed. So, and parts of it, when I get really stuck into the foliage, you'll be watching it at 4 times. You can always use the cog icon to speed up the video, and this voiceover, if you, speed up or slow down. So if you slow it down, I'll sound like I've had too much to drink or something, but you'll still be able to understand what I'm saying. Or if you just want to watch the mark making in more detail, you can slow it down to half speed and turn the sound off and just watch it. Notice here, I draw the figure sitting on the bench before I draw the bench. I find that's a much better way to end up with a figure that looks like it's sitting on the bench. If we draw the bench first, in my experience, really easy to misposition the head or the torso, and then there's not enough room for the body to sit on the chair, or like they're floating above the chair. So I find this is a better way of doing it. And now, of course, I'm working at lining up these seats in a row. And remember that they get smaller as they get further away. Here we see them in less detail. Now I'm just working to darken the overall effect. And a good thing to realize, if you don't already, is when we do hatching with a finer pen, we can do the lines very, very close together, and it still gives a lighter, grayer, and yet also dense effect compared to doing the same thing, same hatching, same distance apart, with a thicker pen. It's because the width of the actual ink marks is still wider, and therefore if we have the same gap between them, it creates a different effect. So it's worth playing around with that, because different value is a great way of creating distinction between different elements of our drawing, but also particularly for different distance, because there are these 3 depths of plane in this. There's the shrub in the lower left and the paving in the lower right. There's that midground where the figure sits, and I think those trees a bit further behind. And then there's the street and the building and whatever else is there behind. So, and there's also those leaves in the upper right. Now, I think they're always great to do because they really pull the depth of plane close to us as the observer. And the effect that has is it makes the distance between the nearest and the furthest thing feel much longer. And that means that we're left really having a longer distance to walk into the scene that we've drawn. Now notice I don't get too precise with these cars here. Firstly, because, well, it's a bit hard to exactly work out what's what. But I don't want to overdo this part because there really is a lot of clutter there. I want to really suggest that there are cars there without making it too obvious a point. This pathway is going to be really important too. One of the challenges when we have a road or a footpath that goes off into the distance, whether it's straight or whether it has a nice little waviness to it, such as this one, is that it can take up an awful lot of the foreground and it can just look very blank and very empty. And sometimes it can grab our attention in ways that we don't really want it to. So it's really important to work out ways of putting marks on that section to create whatever ground effects we have, whether it is a bitumen roadway, whether it's cobblestone such as this, whether it's gravel, if it's outside, leaf litter, whatever. And the most important thing is foreshortening. That visually, as this plane moves further away from us, we get compression from side to side, but also compression from top to bottom. And so the pavers rapidly become very, very small. So I want to suggest that there are pavers just by drawing a few in detail. I want to suggest this wonderful fan-shaped pattern, but recognizing the fact that we only really see the fan effect in a couple of places quite close. That because of the way it's been constructed and the viewing angle, although we see patterns of lines and rows, they might be straight, they might be random, they might be curved in different parts. So I'm going to try and capture a little bit of that. I do have a video on drawing pavers. That's actually a drawing on the top of Montmartre, and they are fan-shaped pavers such as this, only French ones rather than Italian ones. And the important thing to realize is that we don't take this detail too far back, because otherwise it will skew our sense of scale. What do you think? Please hit that like button if you haven't already. A long drawing session is great. The potential for what we can do is great, but we want to make sure that we're ready for it, that we've prepared in our mind everything we need to have considered, so that we can really give ourselves every chance of a drawing that we're going to be happy with, that really will fulfill at least some of our hopes and dreams when we started. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope this is helpful. You'll find this reference, of course, on my channel post page. There is a link to that photo in the description below. But whether you draw this or something else, and however long it takes and however complex or simple it might be, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.